Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 471, Surrender in the Raging Flames. The meat grinder was formed, and it began to turn. Hundreds and thousands of infantrymen fell on the pile of rubble and were trampled by their comrades at the back. They continued to rush madly into the city wall, using all means, even their own bodies were rushing in. There was no way at all. Even the people at the front wanted to escape because of the cruel resistance of the defenders in the castle. However, the infantrymen at the back pushed them forward. The front row had already died. The infantrymen at the back became the front row and continued to die. Just like this, rows and rows of infantrymen died one after another. More and more infantrymen of the Noble Alliance army poured into Moss Castle and then scattered in all directions. They completely broke into the castle's city wall system and began to destroy it. The defenders hiding in the towers and walls were all captured and executed. More people began to rush towards the main body of the castle. However, the castle gates were all closed. The windows on the ground floor were blocked. It was like a turtle shell that could not be bitten. Even if there were gaps, there were infantrymen with long lances guarding the rear. As long as someone approached, they would instantly stab out like a poisonous snake. It was very sudden and fatal. In addition, there were arrow towers and sentry towers at the top of the castle, which could shoot down arrows at any time, causing a lot of casualties. This was the defensive mode of the castle. However, this kind of defense was much more passive. As for this kind of defensive mode, Rolf and Firentis also had their own methods to deal with it. A large amount of firewood was piled up to the outer side of the castle. They were stacked up layer by layer. The entire castle was piled up by a large amount of firewood, and then doused with kerosene provided by the Wayne family. Finally, a torch was thrown up. In an instant, a huge fire rose, and a scorching wave of fire swept through the inner walls of the castle. The castle became a huge torch. Thick smoke and heat waves poured in. The entire Moss Castle seemed to have turned into a sea of flames. Even the corpses were thrown into the castle, creating even more intense black smoke. Then, the smoke poured in through the gaps of the castle. It was like a snake that had found a gap. Bit by bit, waves by waves, the castle was filled with a large amount of smoke and dust. In addition to the raging flames, the entire 16-meter-tall castle was unable to breathe. The oxygen was consumed by the fire outside. And inside, large number of soldiers in the narrow space were even more severely depleted of oxygen. The sounds of coughs, shouts, and miserable howls were incessant. The entire castle was like a large chimney. Under the destruction of the fire and the thick smoke, many soldiers had already escaped to the top floor, but it was still useless. There was too much thick smoke outside. The castle was not far. On a hill, Firentis and Rolf stood side by side. Viscount Wayne, the other barons, and the other lords stood there, watching as the distant Moss Castle fell into a sea of fire. Their expressions were complicated. Moss Castle, which had once been independent of the North County, had now turned into such a miserable state. It made them feel a little sorrowful, or rather, fear from the bottom of their hearts. In the direction of the castle, the Noble Alliance army, which used to belong to them, cheered. They were like crazy thugs who had been bewitched. Interesting. Rolf grinned hideously. He looked at the castle that had turned into a sea of fire in front of him. He could not help but take a deep breath. This is how war works. It destroys everything, kills everything, burns everything, and demolishes everything. Whether it is a civilization or a kingdom, what is finally rebuilt is our new home. Viscount Wayne and the others revealed dry smiles, but when they looked at the burning castle over there was not the slightest hint of a smile on their faces. Even their eyes were filled with extreme panic. They had never seen such a scene when the Silver Platter Kingdom invaded the Dukedom of Leo. But now, they had seen it during the internal strife in the Dukedom of Leo. It was incomparably cruel to their own people, to the point that it made their hearts tremble. Even Firentis could not bear to see such a thing happen. However, he was still thinking about the outcome of this battle. They were Caradians, not people from the Dukedom of Leo. Why should they pity them? They wanted to conquer their own territory in this land. Everything was for Lord Kent. And for themselves. All right, they have surrendered. On the castle in front of them, the white flag had already been raised. In this world, the white flag also represented surrender. Right at the sealed gate of Moss Castle, there were Grand Knights who used their extraordinary powers to blast a passage through the fire, escorting Viscount Kevin, who was already drenched in sweat and his face was covered in soot, came out. He panted heavily outside the castle, as if he was about to die. Behind him, his family members were also brought out. The soldiers swarmed out of the castle. They were surrounded by the Noble Alliance army and had no intention of resisting. See, this is very simple. Rolf's sinister smile became more and more exuberant. He turned his head to look at Viscount Wayne and the other nobles, and said with a sinister smile, "It is necessary for you to take the lead and join us. Look at Viscount Kevin now, how are we going to treat him?" Gulp. Viscount Wayne and the other nobles subconsciously gulped. The answer is very simple. Rolf chuckled. Just execute him. What? A noble said in disbelief. Without the permission of the noble court, you can't just execute a noble. You also don't have the right to execute a noble. That's right, a noble cannot be executed without permission. How can a noble be executed without going through the court's judgment? It's absolutely impossible. Please respect the noble's honor. Many nobles voiced their objections. However, Rolf picked his ears. Is there anything else? The honor of a noble cannot be killed without permission. He pulled out his scimitar. You don't seem to understand. You're all captives and not here as a guest. Do I have to kill all of you before you know what fear is? You the nobles were instantly embarrassed and angry, but they didn't dare to say anything because of the cold glint of the scimitar. They could see that Rolf really dared to kill people. Go and tie up all those guys. Rolf issued an order. Pull the noble to this side and isolate them. Send the women to the Wayne family and let them take care of them. As for the soldiers, break up the formation and integrate them into the Noble Alliance army. Break up and reorganize the Noble Alliance army as well. Phyrontis added from the side. Do it immediately. Organize them before nightfall. We will set off again the next morning. After pausing for a moment, his tone was very firm. At the same time, find the warehouse of this castle and give all the wealth to these soldiers who have already reorganized themselves. Yes, the messenger who was waiting behind immediately nodded and left to pass on the order. Elite desert bandits were still waiting for the order. They were the ones who carried out the order and were the commanders who were usually responsible for supervising the Noble Alliance army. Elite desert bandits were also scattered into the Noble Alliance army in order to control the troops formed by civilians. Moreover, on the battlefield, they were in charge of the middle-level command, not the bottom-level frontline battle force. Chapter 472, The Decisive Battle That Deciding the Future. The fall of Moss Castle was already within expectations. After calculating, the number of garrison troop was only 2,500 people, and most of them were armed militia gathered from the surrounding villages. They did not have any combat strength. In the battlefield, they would definitely be slaughtered by the regular army. In fact, Viscount Kevin did not dare to let his troops fight the Kent army outside. Even the stupidest commander would not make such a decision. Just look at it. The Lord of the North County, Viscount Wayne, was stronger than Viscount Kevin. They spent a huge amount of money to build a Noble Alliance army. Even the nobles of the South County were unexpectedly silent. It was obvious that they had tacitly agreed to the situation. However, in the open plains of the North County, they were defeated in less than a night. Not only were nearly 10,000 mercenaries slaughtered, even the originally organized Noble Alliance army had been captured. Now, they had become the accomplices of the Kent army. That was the truth. Not to mention the message from the soldiers who had secretly escaped in the night and were lucky enough to stay alive. Even the mercenaries who had luckily escaped the slaughter in pursuit of the light cavalry and had been completely scared out of their wits had proved that the flat plains of the North County had become the territory of Baron Kant. The elite and brave light cavalry, as well as the terrifying armored heavy cavalry. No one could resist them. In addition, there were the infantry soldiers of the Noble Alliance army who had surrendered. It was as if the entire North County had been consolidated into a strong and complete single entity. There was no infighting between the noble families, nor was there any backsliding between the noble families. In addition, there was the fanatical belief of conferring the title of noble, as well as the large amount of silver coins obtained from the salt mines as rewards. Those commoners who were eager to change their lives now had all become like greedy wolves. Even with green eyes, they still wanted to fight. From the mouth of the Resnistican River, the Sargoth had upgraded into a castle. Kant was currently stationed there, and the water force was rapidly developing. There were new orders and guidance. According to the military merits, one would be conferred a title of nobility, given land according to the results of the battle, and receive a pension according to their performance on the battlefield before they died. It was a very simple instruction. It was nothing more than a form of encouragement that relied on a large amount of land and money. In the ancient eastern countries of Earth, it had long become a fixed system. However, in this feudal world, where noble blood determined everything, and the commoners could never stand out, it burst out with absolute power. The infantrymen formed by the lower-class commoners had already become Kant's loyal followers. Of course, the noble families that had their fundamental interests touched had a lot of complaints. They could only complain, but Hay could not resist this system at all. This was because after Phyrontus and Rolf used the scimitar to force all the troops to break up and regroup, these noble families lost their control over the troops. They could not gather their former subordinates in a short period of time. However, even if they were to gather them, there was nothing they could do. This was because the company control was also implemented. If one of the comrades in the same team rebelled, the others did not organize or report the entire team, they would be killed. It was still as simple and crude as before, but it was more effective. Most importantly, 3,000 Swadian footmen from the Stone Pass came over. They wore mail armor and robes that were not new, but they were definitely well repaired. They held a spear and sword, and a round shield hung on their backs. They looked like they were even richer than the knights in the Noble Alliance army. They were integrated into the Noble Alliance army and held the position of a squad leader. However, it was not absolute. Among the scattered infantry, if there were 10 people in each squad, one of them would definitely be a Swadian footman. Moreover, in each 100-person squadron, there was a squad made up entirely of Swadian footmen to maintain the front line or supervise the battle. It was equivalent to a squad under the command of a squad leader. As for those squadron leaders, they were also made up of Swadian heavy cavalries. Noble knights were all integrated into Phyrontus's cavalry unit. More than 800 people were not considered a lot. They were closely watched by the 1,500 Swadian knight and Swadian heavy cavalry. As for the light cavalry that originally belonged to the Noble Alliance army, their scouts were also integrated into Rolf's light cavalry unit. They did not have the slightest chance to act alone. In just a short week's time, at the burned black ruins of Moss Castle, the unit was completed. 15,000 infantrymen. 2,100 heavy cavalries. 1,600 light cavalries. Some of them belonged to the Karadia unit. There were also some that belonged to the noble families of the North County. They were completely mixed together. There were even Viscount Kevin's unit that had previously chosen to surrender and hand over the command of the unit. They had become captives. Relying on the current Moss Castle, these troops continued to rush towards the south. Like a surging flood, they set off a huge wave that was about to engulf the entire Dukedom of Leo. At the same time, they were also washing away all the resistance and decay. Even in the East County, the noble families who were already afraid of Kant began to contact this place. Countless carriages formed a convoy to transport all sorts of supplies. They were all provided by the noble families of the East County on their own initiative. This included a huge amount of food, replacement weapons, replacement shields, and bundles of arrows. There were also a large number of siege weapons. Moreover, many noble families had even sent their most considerate butlers over. Each of them wore a black robe with a hood. Like thieves, they gave unsigned letters and did not say much. However, after opening the letters, the nobles all said that they could provide more help. For example, troops. Phyrontus and Rolf did not dare to make a decision on this point. After discussing, they still passed the message to Lord Cant of the East County. After all, this kind of thing still needed their lord to personally make a decision. After all, the current strategy was to directly attack the South County. On the second day after the troops started to attack the South County, the news was passed back. Sure. This was Cant's reply. At the same time, the capital of the East County, an army of 10,000 infantrymen set off. Very quickly, they joined the forces of the North County, allowing the overall strength of the army to reach around 35,000 soldiers. In the Dukedom of Leo, it could be considered a very large army, a level that ordinary noble allied forces could not reach. There were no mercenaries among them. They were all the forces of the noble families. They were completely assembled in the context of a country war. However, in the center of Lionheart City and Lion Fort, at countless farms, an army of 20,000 people was waiting for orders. On the flag fluttered a lion that was baring its fangs and brandishing its claws, as well as all kinds of flags that belonged to the top noble families. Obviously, during this period of time, the noble families of the South County finally reacted, and all began to assemble. They were ready to have a decisive battle with the allied forces of Cant on the plains of the South County. They would decide who would rule the Dukedom of Leo. Chapter 473, The Secretly Prepared Serfs. Of course, the South County would not sit idly by and watch the North County's troops invade. The previous shirking and compromise had announced the importance of the South County from the day Moss Castle fell, especially the high-ranking noble families that represented the South County. To heavily injure the South County was to heavily injure them. In just a few hundred years, these high-ranking noble families had been bound to the South County. In fact, the invasion of the Silver Platter Kingdom back then was not resisted by the Grand Duke Leo. Instead, it was these high-ranking noble families who had stubbornly resisted the attack. They were unwilling to give up their strength and their families which had been completely rooted in South County. Now, facing the noble army of the North County, the troops of the South County had finally gathered. The 20,000-men army was neat and elite. They were led by 5,000 knights, 15,000 knight attendants and the corresponding cavalry squires were supporting them. All of them were cavalry troops, and they were extremely mobile. This was also the army that the Dukedom of Leo was most proud of. In the battle against the Silver Platter Kingdom, it was these cavalry troops that were extremely mobile that cut off the Silver Platter Kingdom's infantryman supply line. They weaved in and out of surprise attacks, and only then did they manage to defeat the enemy army that had the advantages in quality and quantity. In the plains, cavalry was the king, and infantry was just an easy target. The leading Viscount of the South County was very confident. However, he was not arrogant. This was his foundation. The training from a noble family allowed him to hold an extremely high position in commanding troops. He was already over 35 years old, and he no longer had the arrogance of a young man. He only saw this battle as his gold-plated mission. If he completed it well, then he would be the new Viscount who had bravely protected the safety of the South County. If he fought cleanly and won beautifully, it was not impossible for him to become a count by his battle achievements. And these were also the unspoken rules of the noble families. They would help him ascend to the throne. This battle was the best foundation for him to ascend to the throne. Sometimes, mutual compromise could actually result in someone's success. Thinking about the upcoming marriage, the young viscount of this high-ranking noble family of the South County smiled. No matter which family he married, it would allow him to advance further. Perhaps after defeating the country bumpkins in the North County, he would still be able to control the barren wilderness. Although the land was barren, the salt mine from the Narran Desert was a good thing. Even the high-ranking noble families from the South County drooled over it. The reason why they had not attacked was because they were worried about the sudden attack of the Silver Platter Kingdom. After all, the Dukedom of Leo was still in stalemate with this old enemy. If they were not careful, the entire dukedom would probably be annexed into 3 new counties of the Silver Platter Kingdom. This was not something they wanted to see. However, now that the North County had taken the initiative to attack, they could easily defeat the invading troops and then counterattack the North County. Then, Narran Desert would be theirs. They were determined to obtain that salt mine for the huge profit. On the plains of the South County, countless farms were retreating, and many serfs and free citizens were escaping the flames of war. However, they hadn't gone far. This battle was destined for victory, and the lingering prestige of the South County was still resounding in their hearts. Most importantly, the elites of the Dukedom of Leo had never let anyone down. Even if the group of noble from the North County came to attack, they might just be sending themselves to their deaths. Wasn't the Silver Platter Kingdom like this back then? Now, there were also serfs in some farms. They were prisoners of war captured by the noble from the South County of the Dukedom of Leo after the Silver Platter Kingdom was defeated. They were not exchanged back. Instead, they became serfs who were tortured day and night on the farms. They ate the worst food and were treated as human-shaped livestock. In the end, they were exhausted and died on the farms. Even their corpses were buried in the ground to fatten up. The defeated had no human rights, let alone the defeated invaders. Therefore, the outcome of the battle had nothing to do with them. It did not matter who had the upper hand. They were just serfs. No one cared about them, and no one was willing to save them. Perhaps the Silver Platter Kingdom was still preparing for the next attack, but it was another matter whether they were still alive or not. Especially those slave owners or farm owners who had abused them. In order to silence them, they would definitely hang these serfs first. The Silver Platter Kingdom was also happy to see this happen. After all, some prisoners of war had become serfs, so it was a bit awkward. However, there were also voices coming from this group of serfs. There were some serfs who used to be commanders in the past. They were all secretly contacted each other. After all, the farms were all connected. Some of the serfs had also become small leaders. Secretly, they arranged a few serfs who went out to work. It was also very easy for them to send messages to each other. Very quickly, in less than half a month, all the serfs had already heard the news. No one betrayed them, because the ones left were the ones who suffered the most. If it was possible. No one wanted to continue living like this. Moreover, these prisoners of war of the Silver Platter Kingdom were themselves, so how could they be willing to die here? Just as the South County organized their troops and attempted to wipe out the North County Territory's troops, these serfs also began to organize themselves. Close to 5,000 people were distributed in the various farms in the South County, carefully collecting any supplies. These supplies included specially sharpened pitchforks and sickles, sturdy wooden boards, tattered cloth, and animal skin. There was also a little bit of black bread left over every day. Pitchforks and sickles could be used as weapons. Wooden boards could be made into shields. Animal skin was washed and dried with feces and urine, which was equivalent to leather made from nitrite. It was a good defensive tool. Everything was in the process of preparation, but these serfs' small actions had not been seen by the high and mighty management. Perhaps to them, it was simply impossible for the serfs to erupt into rebellion. The South County was so powerful that it had even defeated the Silver Platter Kingdom. How could a group mere serfs rebel them? What a joke! Everyone did not take it seriously. They were a group of people who did not have enough to eat or warm their clothes, were doing farm work all day long. Even eating meat was an extremely extravagant thing. How could they have the strength to make these serfs rebel? However, the management did not expect that the wealth of the South County had already exceeded their imagination. At the very least, the black bread was actually not bad. It was well made that there was not even sawwood powder in it. In the North County, only the rich freemen could eat this black bread. And the meat could be eaten if they caught field mice or water snakes. The South County was really a good place. These seemingly exhausted and weak serfs were actually taught muscles. And that tiredness was only consumed by the high-intensity farm work every day. Once they stopped their farm work, they would be a group of rebellious serfs who were unwilling and wanted to overthrow the South County. They would be filled with hatred. Chapter 474, The Light Cavalries that Plundered in the Dark. The decisive battle had yet to begin. Both sides were in a stalemate, carefully testing each other's reactions. Most importantly, the troops of South County had yet to transport enough supplies to support a battle. After all, with 20,000 cavalries gathered here, their daily consumption was equivalent to over 50,000 infantrymen. If they did not have the advantage, the troops of the South County would not dare to launch an attack. After all, the Kant's army had close to 30,000 soldiers. Although most of them were infantrymen, if they were to form a tight defensive formation, even if the 20,000 Knight Corps would suffer great casualties if they tried to break through the infantrymen's tight formation, especially when the infantrymen were mainly using lance. The noble families of the East County had already sent a huge number of resources through the geographical advantage. Of course, there were also many long lances to defend against the cavalry. The commander, Firentus, had already ordered the infantrymen to equip themselves with long lances. In addition, the North County army was equipped with many long lances and spears. Most of the soldiers had formed a phalanx of long lances to defend against the charge of the cavalry. They even formed a wall of spears to slow down the advance and mobility of the enemy cavalry. Because of this, the noble knights of the South County did not attack. They were waiting. Time was on their side. As they dragged on, their morale and stamina would increase, and they would have more resources. On the other hand, the morale of the North County Alliance army led by Firentus would decrease and their resources would be depleted. Not to mention fighting, if they ran out of food for 2 to 3 days, they would collapse. The Knights of the South County Alliance army did not even need to do anything. However, they were currently facing a lot of trouble themselves. There were 20 knights with 20,000 men, but they all occupied 20 farms. They were close to the front lines where both sides were facing off. However, in these farms, even if there were knight attendants patrolling continuously, they would still notice the enemy light cavalry that occasionally entered. They would not get close and would turn around to run. However, when they chased after them, they would realize that it was a trap. That was because there were sharp and heavy short javelins were thrown over from the hands of the enemy light cavalry. They turned around and threw. Coupled with the speed and inertia of their own horses, they chased madly. In less than 2 days, nearly 600 knight attendants were seriously injured or killed. The casualties were heavy. However, when they chased out to surround them, they encountered even more light cavalry. Rolf's light cavalries had already spread out over the mountains and plains. They didn't lure the knight attendants into the defensive line of their heavy cavalry and infantrymen. Instead, they directly led them into the depths of the South County and into the plains. Due to the development of agriculture in the South County, the roads were also flat. The dirt or paved roads that were easy to transport in the past had now become a passage for the troops to advance at high speeds. Even if the roads were blocked, it did not matter. They could still gallop across the plains of the South County. They would not encounter any obstacles at all. Even the knight attendants didn't chase after them too far and retreated, because they were afraid that they would be alone. They could only wait for the final battle. Hence, Rolf and the others charged into the South County. The farms had long since been emptied, and even the warehouses were empty. There was nothing of value left behind to prevent them from being used by the enemy. At the same time, it also meant that there were no troops to defend, allowing them to move about on their own. They had even almost reached Lionheart City. It was the largest city in the South County. It was also one of the only 2 trading cities in the Dukedom of Leo. However, Rolf did not give the order to enter Lionheart City. Instead, he led his troops back and spread out in the starry night to kill any enemies that might appear. He also defeated small groups of patrolling troops and caused damage at the rear. This was also to increase the pressure on the troops of those noble families in the South County. There was no other way. Rolf also knew that time was not on his side. If he did not want to be dragged to death, he could only rely on the infantry and to wear down the enemy Knight Corps. Then, at the most critical moment, he would let his light cavalry harass them. Then, he would let Phyrontis's heavy cavalries finish the battle. Even if they were left with nothing, or if both sides suffered heavy losses, it would be good for them. This was because this was not the main force of Kant's troops. In the distance, at the mouth of the Resnistican River, an army composed of the Rhodoks and Nords was gathering. As long as the decisive battle here began, then a dagger would appear on this wide river, stabbing straight into the heart. Kant would personally lead this water army to capture Lionheart City by the lower river. Moreover, he would also give the noble knights of the South County a heavy punch. The best plan was to directly crush the resistance of the South County. At the very least, the South County would fall into a state of disorder for a short period of time. Then, their troops would gather together and directly rush towards the Lion Fort, the administrative center of the Dukedom of Leo, which was also Kant's former home. Under the starry night, in the fields outside the South County, Rolf was leading a team of light cavalry as they traveled rapidly. On the horizon ahead, there was a long dragon carrying a torch. It looked like a carriage and trade caravan. It was a team that transported daily supplies to the knights of the South County. This was their target. As light cavalry soldiers, their tactical missions had the function of disrupting the enemy's supply line. Rolf was also clear about his position. After thinking for a while, he waved his hand forward. Woo! The longhorn sound was immediately blown. The desert bandits who were the commanding soldiers put down the horn and pulled out their spears. They and the other team members at the back looked at Rolf and slowly urged their warhorse forward. Kill! Rolf naturally did not say anything. After waving his hand forward, he also pulled out his scimitar. Around the transport team, groups of light cavalries appeared in the darkness. Like wolves, they charged out of the darkness and rushed towards the transport team that was already nervous. There were more than 500 people in their team and more than 100 carriages. However, Rolf's light cavalry had 300 people. They whistled past. These desert bandits were close to a profession when it came to plundering transport squads. As they threw pylons one after another, taking advantage of the fact that the defending transport squads did not have time to react, they grabbed their scimitars and charged straight into these transport teams, which were mostly coachmen, and began to slaughter them wantonly. They naturally did not need any survivors, especially on the plains of the South County. Leaving any survivors was equivalent to exposing themselves. War was always cruel. Lord, an elite desert bandit came over. His face was filled with joy. It's all food. It should be enough for the Knight Corps to use for 3 days. As he spoke, he took out a flint and a water sack filled with grease. He raised his eyebrows and said, "Do you want to have a barbecue party? Don't be nosy." Rolf glanced at him and said calmly, "Leave after you burn it." "Yes." He did not dare to continue to talk nonsense. He found some linen to connect the carriage that was gathered together. Then, he poured some kerosene into it and threw it over. The raging flames instantly soared into the sky and lit up the plains. One could see it clearly even if they were more than 10 miles away. It was estimated that even the farms where the knights were stationed could be seen clearly by the watchtower. Chapter 475, The Turmoil in the Dukedom of Leo. In just a few days, the logistics supply line of the Night Corps had suffered a devastating blow. A large number of transport convoys from the Lion Fort and Lionheart City were all targeted by the light cavalry troop led by Rolf. Then, they took advantage of the night when everyone was relaxed to launch a sudden attack. They did not linger for long and set the carriage on fire before running away. With the raging flames, although the transport caravans did not suffer too much damage, they lost a lot of resources. Sometimes, even the people were slaughtered. It was a typical act of bandits. No, that was not entirely true. Although the various noble families in the Dukedom of Leo had done many filthy things, there were actually not many true bandits. They were all wolf dogs reared by the noble families. Only at certain times would they attack the trade caravan. However, when the orders came from their master, it was as if they were chained again, completely silent. Therefore, the various forces in the Dukedom of Leo were all dogs reared by the noble families. If it was necessary, they would be unleashed and bite people. There was no need for that, they would stay at home quietly. As for the current Rolf, he had started to act unscrupulously in the plains of the South County and all sorts of farms. He would burn, kill, and plunder anything. That was simply something that he didn't even dare to think about. But because of that, the management of the South County and the noble families didn't even have time to react. In 3 days, Rolf had burned more than 50 farms in the South County. Even more than 10 villages had been burned, causing close to 10,000 refugees to gather towards Lionheart City. The entire South County was in chaos. In addition, Rolf's troop could attack at any time, plundering and looting the grain of the transport team. They even distributed the grain to the refugees. Rolf made the situation even more chaotic. They were all light cavalry, causing the Night Corps of the South County, who were used to fighting in groups, to be at a loss. That was the function of the irregular cavalry. Harassment. Apart from having a mobility advantage when fighting the infantry on the battlefield, in non-battlefield areas, they could also cause all sorts of trouble to the enemy. For example, a lack of food would cause a famine. Of course, there would be famine in the army. Not to mention, it was an army of over 20,000 heavy cavalry soldiers. The amount of food they needed was an astronomical figure. The amount of food they consumed every day was equivalent to the consumption of 50,000 infantrymen. If it was before the start of the war, the amount of food they needed would increase even more. After all, they needed to maintain the physical strength of the army in the short term to ensure that they could continue fighting on the battlefield for a long time. This was how Rolf impacted the Night Corps of the South County. He attacked the grain channel. He harassed the traditional planting areas. He drove the peasant to become refugees and destroyed the agricultural structure. He even blocked off the areas, attacked the transportation lines, and harassed the cities and the troops that came to sweep the area. He did this so that in this battle, he would constantly harass the enemies and make them run for their lives. Under this high-pressure status, the enemy would collapse on their own, or rather, walk towards destruction. The noble infantrymen who had already formed a defensive formation did not care about the charge of the knights at all. The infantrymen who could line up into a square formation with lances and spears in their hands were as spiking as hedgehogs. Want to attack and charge? What a joke! Those members of the Night Corps would definitely leave behind corpses on the sharp heads of lances and spears. Even if they used the weight and inertia of the war horses to break through a part of the square formation of the long lance, how could the cost-benefit ratio of both sides be proportional? A group of low-quality conscripted militia and hired peasant in North County could exchange their lives with the lives of these knights who had been training all year round just by receiving a few months of military training every year. It was worth it just by looking at it, not to mention that in order to break through the layers of defensive lance formation, they would have to lose at least 5,000 knights or knight attendants in order to do so. Most importantly, they would suffer severe casualty. If 5,000 knights died in battle, wouldn't that mean that the remaining people were all injured? This was a conservative estimate, because among the 20,000 infantrymen, there was still a heavy cavalry unit of over 3,000 people. They were fully armored, and their strength was not inferior to the Knight Corps of South County. If a battle really broke out between the two sides, it would only happen if one side fell. The battle situation would be extremely tragic. However, based on the current situation, the troops of the North County might had to stand on the spot and defend the borders of the South County. In that case, they would be like hedgehogs, the noble Knight Corps would not be able to bite them. Even if the troops of the North County moved slightly, they would be able to form a gap and create a flaw. That was the door through which the knights charged in. However, the infantrymen of the North County did not move at all. They continued to stand guard on the spot. They did not even care about the transportation teams. Even if the South County sent the light cavalry to scout or harass them, they would not do anything. The biggest reason was that as the commander of the troops of the North County, Firentus did not care at all. The advantage of the South County was that their cavalry unit was formed by the heavy cavalry, not the light cavalry. The light cavalry, who wore simple leather armor or did not wear armor at all, only had the role of scouting. It was laughable to let the light cavalry to charge at the transportation team that was protected by the longsword soldiers. As long as the carriages were lined up in a chariot formation and connected into a low wall, the light cavalry that held a spear or longsword would be useless. After a few days, the knights of the South County recalled their light cavalry. It was not because the effect was not good. It was because an even more unexpected trouble had arrived. In the various farms deep within the South County, the slaves that were originally prisoners of war of the Silver Platter Kingdom had started a massive uprising. They had killed many of the farms' owners and taken over the farms, starting to rebel against the rule of the South County territory. This was an extremely unexpected incident. Many farms in the South County were destroyed in a short period of time. The rebellion had erupted. Other than the area around Lionford and Lionheart City, the other places were all in a mess. That's right, the prisoners of the Silver Platter Kingdom had rebelled, calling themselves the Uprising Army. They didn't gather at the same place but spread in all directions. They destroyed the farms in the South County of the Dukedom of Leo, saving more slaves, and at the same time, they plundered more peasants. This made the civilians who originally lived in the villages become rebels. In just a few days, they had already become an army of more than 20,000 people. Compared to Rolf's light cavalry, they were even more savage. They swept through everything like locusts, eating, drinking, killing, and burning. They completely focused on destroying the South County. The entire north bank of the Resnistican River was in complete chaos. Even the private armies of the noble families began to struggle to quell the chaos, but the effect was limited. Everyone's vision was drawn to the allied army of the North County. They had never thought that the slaves under their care would also start a rebellion. Moreover, because it was the captives of the Silver Platter Kingdom who started the rebellion, they did not care about how much damages they did to the Dukedom of Leo. Everything they encountered was burned to the ground, including the originally lush fields and forests, and even the villages. It seemed that they had the resolution to die, and they definitely did not want to let the Dukedom of Leo have a good time. Chapter 476, The Connection Between the Rebellion Forces. The rebellion forces in the South County were huge, but the only forces capable of quelling the rebellion were Grand Duke Cameron of Lionfort, the troops under his direct command, and the city defense forces of Lionheart City. In addition, there were the private armies of the noble families scattered in the manors of the South County, and of course, there were also the 20 Knight Corps stationed in the north of the South County. Strangely, the direct forces of the Grand Duke of Lionfort did not move out. The city defense team of Lionheart City, which was indirectly controlled by many top noble families, also did not move out. Even the private armies of the noble manors did not move out. Only the noble armies of the South County, which were made up of the 20 Knight Corps, chose to divide their forces. The 15 Knight Corps were still stationed here. The remaining 5 Knight Corps led 500 knights and 4,500 heavy cavalries to leave the battlefield. With the high mobility of the cavalry, they went to reinforce the South County's hinterland, which was getting more and more dangerous. Otherwise, hundreds of farms and dozens of villages would be destroyed by the spreading rebel army. One had to know. These farms and villages were the cornerstone of the South County. The resources that the Dukedom of Leo relied on were the grain that they harvested for 2 seasons every year. The fertile land in the South County, coupled with the excellent weather that didn't freeze all year round, had turned Lionheart City, the commercial city of the river, into the largest grain production base of all the human countries. Who knew how many fractions would send their fleets to import large amounts of grain every month? If there were any changes in the South County, then the entire human countries would experience a regional famine. This was definitely not a joke. Although both banks of the Resnistican River were excellent grain cultivation grounds, it still depended on the situation. The other human countries weren't doing so well. Especially after the river had developed, many kingdoms relied on the grain imports from the South County, which increased the importance of this place. Back then, the Silver Platter Kingdom had launched an invasion war against the Dukedom of Leo because of the top-tier agricultural land in the South County. However, because the war had lasted for too long, it had affected the other human kingdoms, and it had finally calmed down. Of course, this had to do with the stubborn resistance of the Dukedom of Leo. However, there was a prerequisite. With the strength of the Silver Platter Kingdom, it could completely annex the Dukedom of Leo. The reason why they did not attack was because the other human kingdoms had intervened. It was not only for the reason that the war would affect the food supply. It was also for the reason that the Silver Platter Kingdom was worried that after annexing the Dukedom of Leo, which was a famous food production area, the country's strength would expand. The current strength of the various human kingdoms was almost the same. Similarly, they were all linked to each other. Once the strength of a kingdom increased explosively, then it would affect the Resnistican River. All the human kingdoms would ensure that their own interests and safety would not be violated. By then, the annexation plan of the Silver Platter Kingdom was destined to fail. However, this didn't mean that the Dukedom of Leo wouldn't have internal strife, especially the conflict between the heirs. This was the common problem of all the human kingdoms. Or rather, as long as there were forces and heirs, there would be a struggle for the throne. The current chaos in the North County could be seen as such a struggle. To the noble families, this was still a result that they could barely accept, or even pinch their noses in agreement. However, this group of rebels who were once captives and now slaves actually dared to rebel against their rule. They were simply courting death. There was no reason for them to survive. As the second son of the Grand Duke, Kant organized troops to seize his own position, or to fight within the noble system. It was completely different from the rebellion of these slaves, who were known as the rebel army. These slaves were completely planning to overthrow their rule, and their attitude was to flip the table. This was also the reason why the noble families were so furious. The most important thing was that the serf rebellion army had destroyed the South County too thoroughly. Burning, killing, and robbing, the damage they caused was even more vicious than Rolf and his light cavalry. Not only did they destroy a large number of farms that originally belonged to the noble families, but they also burned a lot of villages that belonged to the Grand Duke. The fields were directly razed to the ground, and even the wheat seedlings that were sown were completely destroyed. The serfs vented all of their resentments and angers. When their emotions were stirred up after they had eaten and drunk their fill from the robbery, they became even more aggressive. They wanted to completely return all of the torture that they had endured in the Dukedom of Leo to those who had tormented them before. Even a group of civilians from the Dukedom of Leo had been humiliated by these newly risen serfs. They even had the tendency to become rebels together. The innocent was often innocent. In the face of these furious rebels, any civilians who wanted to stay out of it were brutally murdered. The uprisings and rebellions in the feudal era were often accompanied by blood and fire, as well as a large number of withered lives and corpses littered the ground. Buildings and infrastructures were destroyed, including the plague and famine that followed after. This was also the reason why the noble families anxiously mobilized the knights to return and quell the rebellion. There couldn't be anything bad happen to the Lion Fort. Lionheart City still needed to stabilize because of the reliance on the river. As for the manner of the noble families, they wouldn't take out extra troops to quell the rebellion because of their own interests. However, even if there were 5,000 knights, a total of 5 knight corps, they could still finish off the rebel army that had already increased to 30,000 people. In fact, they could even wipe out these so-called rebel army in an instant. So what if the prisoners of the Silver Platter Kingdom were the main force? After losing 10 years of time, these prisoners could not form an effective defense. Perhaps their memories and experience were still there, but after 10 years of serfdom, how could these slaves resist the powerful knights? Most importantly, these serfs probably could not even bring their armor. This was the thought of the knights, and it was also the common thought of most of the noble families. Of course, it wasn't Rolf's opinion. He had already made contact with the rebellion army. As a light cavalry, he was like a ghost wandering in the South County. He easily came to the territory of the rebellion army and formed an alliance with the rebellion army. He looked at the nearly 10,000 Silver Platter Kingdom captives inside. They were wearing all kinds of leather armor or iron scale armor, with a short sword or hand axe hanging from their waists. They even held a long lance in their hands. He could not help but raise his eyebrows slightly. These used to be the villagers' self-defense. The weapons to arm the militia or recruit the militia had already been grasped by the rebellion army. Although most of the soldiers held pitchforks made of dung and wore leather made of cow or sheep skin, these captives who were former elite soldiers from Silver Platter Kingdom, were no less than ordinary regular soldiers. It could be seen that these captives of the Silver Platter Kingdom had been prepared for 10 years. Perhaps they had long wanted to start a rebellion. They had been waiting for an opportunity. And now, it was a good opportunity for these prisoners to completely mess up and step onto the stage in the Dukedom of Leo. Chapter 477, The Gap Between the Two Sides. Rolf had already met with the leader of the rebellion army. In fact, he did not have a good impression of Korod, who claimed to be a lord of the Silver Platter Kingdom, a former knight, and now the chief commander of the rebellion army. That's right. Rolf, who was at the bottom line of the noble class, actually had a bad impression of the former noble lord. It was indeed hilarious. However, Rolf was indeed disliked this scumbag. He burned, killed, and plundered. He just led his troops to commit all kinds of crimes. He poured out his anger on the citizens of the Dukedom of Leo, who had once treated them badly. Rolf did not like it. However, Rolf had to express his understanding of this behavior. This was also the reason why he did not fall out with them. He was not a good person, but he could not be considered a complete evil person. This sentence was somewhat paradoxical. However, after Rolf and Fyrentus stayed together for a long time, they could feel that their personalities had changed. Perhaps it was because of Kant. The subordinates would take the initiative to change themselves or draw closer to their leader. After all, a game was a game. And now, it was reality. Rolf did not say anything, not even a suggestion. This former lord of the Silver Platter Kingdom was now on the right path. He was using his hatred for the slave owners of the Dukedom of Leo to awaken the fears of his subordinates, who had been serfs for 10 years and were once soldiers. If not for this, they would have been completely annihilated by the countless encirclement and suppression. The troops needed support. Hatred was the most powerful point of support. With hatred towards the Dukedom of Leo, these serfs could erupt with absolute power no matter what. Even if the situation on the battlefield was bad, they could still persevere because of hatred. They gritted their teeth and suffered a large number of casualties. They would only surrender when there was no turning back. And before that, the infantrymen of the Dukedom of Leo had probably already collapsed. Fighting with casualties, this group of hatred-based rebellion army would definitely not be weak. This was why Rolf did not say anything. He was not a good person. Even if he could not stand such burning, killing, and pillaging, he did not stop it. The current rebellion army was just enough to share the pressure of the Alliance Army of the North County. As long as the noble forces of the South County continued to divide their forces to wipe out these guys, they would lose the initiative on the battlefield. If the Alliance Army of the North County won, the South County would become theirs. Of course, the distribution of benefits would be troublesome. At the very least, Rolf did not want the so-called rebellion army to gain even the tiniest bit of benefits. The Dukedom of Leo belonged to Lord Kent. These former serfs had destroyed the basic agriculture of the South County. It would be difficult for them to escape unscathed. As for getting a share, that was just a pipe dream. These captives from the Silver Platter Kingdom would be completely annihilated sooner or later. Rolf already had a plan in his heart. However, this group of captives who could not return to the Silver Platter Kingdom had temporarily placed their hopes on Kent. Although they were still wary of Rolf, they also knew that if they lost the support of external forces, they would sooner or later be completely annihilated by the local noble families of the South County. As the leader of the rebellion army, Korob was very clear that the current situation was at a critical juncture. Therefore, he believed that he could negotiate with Rolf. On a farm somewhere in the South County, Korob sat in the main seat, surrounded by guards and captains in mail armor. According to their former military positions in the Silver Platter Kingdom, they quickly organized a complete command structure. It could be said that they were able to deal with the private armies of the noble families that came to encircle them by relying on the rapid recovery of their former military concepts. More than 10,000 old subordinates of the Silver Platter Kingdom who had gradually recovered their fighting strength, in addition to more than 20,000 peasants or serfs who had been kidnapped. There were not only slaves who had been captured, but also those who became serfs due to bankruptcy. As long as they were used well, they would not be inferior to these old subordinates of the Silver Platter Kingdom. They had no one to rely on to begin with. Now that they had the possibility of becoming free citizens, how could they not work hard? Even if they died and enjoyed themselves for a period of time, that would be enough. Rolf entered the farm and looked at Karad, who was seated in the main seat. Looking around at the guards and other captain, he frowned slightly and said in a deep voice, "Mr. Karad, what's wrong? Please sit down, Mr. Rolf." Karad smiled and looked at him as he nodded. "Nothing much. We plan to talk to you about the direction of the next attack," he continued. "I heard that the Alliance Army of the Northern County is still in a stalemate with the Knight Corps of the South County. It has been a while." "That's right." Rolf frowned. "Then what direction of attack do you want to talk about?" "We found that the original plan, which is attacking the Knight Corps directly and supporting the Alliance Army of the North County from the back, is a little dangerous." Karad did not hesitate. "We want to go around and return to the Silver Platter Kingdom." "That's right, we all want to go home," the other captains nodded. "Go home?" Rolf smiled. "Swim across the Resnistican River and then go back to your Silver Platter Kingdom through the front line of the war set up by Dukedom of Leo on the south bank of the river." Karad and the other captains looked at each other, but they looked at each other. "Stop joking." Ralph was at ease. "You can't even deal with the private army of the South County, and even the larger noble manors. How can you pass through the heavily guarded fortress and bunkers everywhere, as well as the south bank of the Resnistican River, where the war castles are located?" He smiled and said, "Even if the Silver Platter Kingdom wants to bite down on that line of defense, it'll be very difficult." "But we broke through it before," a captain retorted. "That's because the Dukedom of Leo wasn't prepared." Rolf said faintly, "Now, after 10 years of development, most of the taxes of the Dukedom of Leo are used to defend the Silver Platter Kingdom every year. Are you sure you can still break through it?" He shrugged slightly, then nodded and said, "All right, then let's say that the development of the Silver Platter Kingdom is equally huge." After paying a certain price, they finally broke through that defensive line and completely took control of the south bank of the Resnistican River. Just like the south bank of the river in the East County, it became the new county of the Silver Platter Kingdom. But are you sure that your troops can do this? What do you mean? The hot-tempered captain was already frowning. I'm sorry. Rolf shrugged. You guys are really too weak. He looked at the captain in the room. In the end, his gaze fell on Karad. According to our plan, we will directly attack the Knight Corps of the South County from both sides. Then, we will have the right to negotiate with the Dukedom of Leo. When Lord Kant becomes the new Grand Duke, you will be his powerful reinforcements. Rolf said in a deep voice, it's not impossible to become a noble here. Do you think that by returning to the Silver Platter Kingdom, you'll be able to regain your former glory? I'm sorry, but your families would prefer that you die on the battlefield, rather than be humiliated and become captives and serfs, enslaved for 10 years. Chapter 478, There was no other choice. Rolf's words were like a heavy hammer, mercilessly hitting the hearts of the generals and commanders of the rebellion army. This was an undisguised critic and mockery, but no one could refute it, because it was the truth. But it was precisely because they couldn't refute it that they looked at Rolf with red faces and red ears. Every one of their faces were filled with embarrassment and anger. There were even people who slowly put their hands on the scabbard by their waists. If someone took the lead, they would fight with Rolf here, blood splattering on the spot. However, Rolf did not show any fear. He continued to look at them. He even took a step forward and said in a low voice, "What? Did my words cut you to the quick? But this is the truth, isn't it?" "It's the truth," the commander-in-chief of the rebellion army, Korod, nodded. His eyes were also gloomy. "But, Mr. Rolf, isn't it too dangerous for us to attack the Knight Corps of the South County?" He looked around at the middle-level commanders. He said in a deep voice, "I reckon that even if we all go up, we might not be able to wipe out those knights. We are here." Rolf immediately replied, "Our cavalry elites are no less than the knights and knight attendants of the Knight Corps. On the battlefield, we can provide support and ensure the final victory of the war." "You're just saying big words." Someone retorted, "How do we know if you will save us?" The others also retorted, "If you escape, won't we all be wiped out and become your stepping stones?" Rolf laughed and said, "But do you have a choice?" The commanders of the rebellion army in the room immediately became restless. "What do you mean? For example, now?" Rolf spoke very quickly. "There are now 5 Knight Corps and 5,000 heavy cavalry soldiers heading here. They are resting in an abandoned farm not far away from us. As long as they wait until tomorrow morning, they will come near this village and launch the most fatal attack on us." "What?" The commanders of the rebellion army instantly fell silent. "Is this true?" Even Korod gulped, his heart clearly in shock. They had spread out over half of the South County, conquering the city and conquering the land, so strong that even the main forces of the Southern County territory did not dare to fight head-on with them. However, they knew in their hearts, they had only swept through a bunch of villages guarded by the militia and a large number of unarmed villagers. They had not even faced the regular army of the noble families. Facing the manors built by the top-tier noble families, which were like a fortress, they still had the desire to attack in the early stages. They sent their troops over to attack, but after the bitter fight, they did not manage to take down a single manor. They completely gave up on continuing to attack the manors and towns, not to mention the Lion Fort, which was known as the #1 castle in the South County. They were probably completely annihilated under the outer walls of the castle, and they might not even be able to break in. Unless they had the support of the superb siege weapons of the Silver Platter Kingdom, but the current Silver Platter Kingdom could not be contacted at all, and they might facing death in a short period of time, so they did not dare to act rashly. "You think it's fake?" Rolf sneered. The commanders of the rebellion army looked at each other, looking at each other in dismay. Rolf did not give them time to think. He said calmly, "You can send the light cavalry to take a look, but I don't think it's necessary. They have already hidden very well, and they have also sent the light cavalry to scout. They are completely planning to enter a resting status after a long journey and launch an attack tomorrow when they are full of energy. What can we do? Korod felt his mouth dry, and he subconsciously looked at Rolf. Although our troop is around 20,000 to 30,000 people, we are all infantrymen, and our combat strength cannot be guaranteed. You finally thought it through. Rolf looked at the commanders who were avoiding his gaze. That's easy to handle. He held his scimitar and said calmly, look at those heavy cavalry troops. They are not hiding anything. They are completely trying to defeat us in the field. They have made a big mistake of underestimating the enemy. Korod and the middle-level commanders looked at him. Rolf also continued, we can ambush them. The distance is only 3 hours even if we walk. In the dark night, groups of infantrymen rush up and defeat those knights who have gone through a long journey in exhaustion and fear. Is this plan really perfect? Korod gulped and looked at Rolf to remind him, if we don't succeed in our ambush and are counterattacked by them, perhaps we will be the ones to lose in the end. Is there a choice? Rolf asked. No. Korod smiled bitterly. Indeed, there was no choice. The middle-level commanders beside him also understood that what awaited them now was only victory or defeat. There was no third way to go, because no matter where they went, they would face a terrible fate. If they could not even surrender, the South County's noble families would not accept them as captives again. They would most likely be hanged after surrendering. Rolf left the room. Only the commanders of the rebellion army were discussing this plan in whispers. He also knew that this group of people would not have a second choice because from the moment of the rebellion, they were destined to have only two choices, to win and to be hanged in defeat. There was no way to escape. The Silver Platter Kingdom would not send troops to save them, because the kingdom itself was in internal strife. Even if there was no internal strife, they had to break through the Blood County on the south bank of the Resnistican River, which was made up of Fort Valti and Fort Lobito. It was called Blood County, and it was the front line of the Silver Platter Kingdom to the Dukedom of Leo. It had once joined forces with Fort Nazir on the west side to form the defense line of the Resnistican River. Lionheart City and the East County City at the back were the logistical assembly points. They had firmly blocked the Silver Platter Kingdom from the borders. However, because of the country war 10 years ago, the Silver Platter Kingdom had amassed over 100,000 soldiers. They had used the conflict between the South County and East County to brazenly defeat the Dukedom of Leo and forcefully occupy Nazir Fort on the southern bank of the Resnistican River. This was how they managed to tear open a hole in the defense line. However, even if they managed to tear open a hole, it would still be very difficult for them to start a country war. Most of the heavy cavalry troops of the Dukedom of Leo were gathered in the two castles of the Blood County. As long as these two castles were not lost, it did not matter even if the South County and East County were lost. As for the Dukedom of Leo that retreated to the North Prefecture, they would attack from both sides. Especially when the cavalry of the Silver Platter Kingdom could not resist the cavalry of the Dukedom of Leo, the defeat of the entire South County and East County could be salvaged through the victory of the gathering battle on the battlefield. At the very least, the grain that they had stored for a few years was enough for the two castles of the Blood County to defend each other for 3 years. This was also the reason why the rebellion army could not get support. The gains did not make up for the losses. Even though the current Dukedom of Leo seemed to be in turmoil, they had not used their true capital. The Silver Platter Kingdom was also caught in the struggle for the throne and the throne. Even if they saw the internal strife in the Dukedom of Leo, they could not do much about it. They could only wait for the next opportunity. This also caused the rebellion army to ally with Rolf's light cavalry to launch an attack. Chapter 479, Ambush in the Middle of the Night. In the deep darkness of the night, the troops were quickly organized. They were all elites wearing leather armor and holding iron weapons. Most of them were from the Silver Platter Kingdom who became slaves in here. They all harbored deep hatred towards the Dukedom of Leo. This battle decided their future. If they did not want to die in the fertile fields of the South County, then they needed to unite as one and have a will that was close to death to defeat the enemy. However, the civilians who were held hostage could not do this, only the slaves and serfs who were so lowly could achieve this. They had nothing to begin with. Even if they fought to the death, they would only die. Compared to the unbearable amount of labor in the fields, fighting to the death and dying gloriously on the battlefield was not necessarily a shortcut. Dukedom of Leo advocated military force. Although the Silver Platter Kingdom did not have a tradition of putting military force above everything else, it also encouraged the practice of combat techniques. Although they had not fought for as long as 10 years, many things had increased their hostility. The combat techniques that they used to be familiar with were now even more deadly. This was because they wanted to seek an explanation for their humiliating life as slaves. They were even willing to exchange their lives and use the most brutal methods to kill their enemies. One had to know that those who were able to survive in this serf life could be considered the most elite. In addition, some of the serfs that were sold here from various countries were also elite warriors that once defeated in the war. This was also the reason why they were unstoppable in the beginning. It was truly terrifying. In the beginning, the manor owners and village chiefs of the Dukedom of Leo did not care at all. It was not like the serf rebellion had never happened. There were even a few villages that were occupied together. But so what? In the end, they gathered the militia and easily suppressed them. After summing up their experience, the reason why they were able to rebel was not because of inhuman acts such as bullying, beating, and scolding. It was purely because they looked down on the serfs and allowed them to temporarily obtain freedom. From there, they obtained part of the weapons in the beginning. They had caught the guards of the manor or the militia of the village unprepared, resulting in a collapse. However, once the militia of other places were organized, together with many private armies belonging to the noble families, they could easily suppress these rebellions. In fact, most of the fight did not last for more than 3 days. Although the forces of the Dukedom of Leo were fewer than those of the other kingdoms, they were indeed elites. Even the militia was the same. The South County was well known for its wealth, and even the militia had their own horses. In other words, their militia was actually equivalent to the light cavalry that only the well-off freemen could arm. In other human countries, they could be used as small troop commanders or cavalry squads. Compared to the forces of the North County, most of them were mainly infantry, while the South County was mainly cavalry. It was because they were rich. They wore iron scale armor, held a lance and longsword, and had a good horse. They were the militia of the South County. Their combat strength was strong, and their mobility was strong. They were organized like a light cavalry group, and their combat strength was comparable to the desert bandits. After hard training, perhaps even the desert bandits who were good at scattered guerrilla warfare were not as strong as these militia. However, it was precisely because of the wealth of the South County that most people valued their lives. Even the militia who were originally in charge of protecting the country lost the initiative in the waves of attacks, and they even fled. If they did not have a courage to fight, their morale would be completely low. Hence, these horse militia had not joined the battle yet. The noble was also very clear. The combat strength of these militia could only be used to hinder the enemy's attack speed. As for the true main force of the battle, they still had to rely on the Knight Corps. Those true knights, led by the knight attendants, launched a tsunami-like charge, completely crushing the enemy in one wave. There was also a deeper metaphor. They could not let the civilians have too much power, which would affect the control of the nobles' power. Just as they were thinking about this, the 5 Knight Corps came to the valley of the South County. They were resting, but they did not know that in the village in the distance, nearly 20,000 infantrymen were gathering, holding long lance and running quickly, ready to launch a direct night attack on them. For this night attack, the soldiers of the rebellion army did not even use any cavalry. Everything was for success. Late at night, the light of the stars and the moon shone on the land of South County. Groups of infantrymen appeared in the dense forest outside the valley. In the valley, most of the members of the Knight Corps were still resting. Only a few dozen people stood at the crucial checkpoint as sentries. However, looking at the weak and exhausted look of them leaning against the tree, one could tell that their minds were not in it. After traveling for such a long distance, even riding horses was already quite tiring. Right now, they wished to sleep the most. However, this was obviously not the case now. The enemy was in a village not far away. Although based on their experience, they could easily wipe out the rebellion of the serfs. However, these rebellions had swept through so many villages. It had never happened before, and due to the war for the throne being ongoing, they obviously did not dare to let their guard down easily. However, it did not mean that they would act as sentries with absolute vigilance. After all, they had easily wiped out the small rebel army that they had encountered before. This made them very optimistic, and they even suggested that they take a day off and rest for 3 days. Using the reason to quell the rebellion to take a good rest on the second line was undoubtedly the best enjoyment. At the very least, the front line still had pressure on the troops of the North County. After all, although the North County was poor, its people were intrepid. Even if there were fewer cavalries, they could still cause them casualties. If they were to waste their lives there, they might as well temporarily hide in the second line and wait for the final battle. However, in the middle of the night, not far away from these sentries, in the darkness, many figures appeared. Bandit elites from the Sarand desert went up. In their hands were not scimitars. Instead, it was a spearhead that was like a dagger. Both of their boots were wrapped in a few layers of linen, and they did not make any sound when they walked. One by one, they slowly went up. Just when these sentries were bored to death and were still dozing off, they suddenly pounced forward and pierced the throats of these sentries with the spearhead. In less than 10 minutes, dozens of sentries were all killed. Under the moonlight, there were still hundreds of tents neatly set up in the valley. These tents represented the number of 5 knights, close to 5,000 people. However, on both sides of the valley and at the entrances and exits of the valley, there were over 20,000-man rebel army blocking the way. Furthermore, they were still moving forward step by step, gradually reaching the distance where the infantrymen could charge. Chapter 480, Slow Reaction. Kill. Finally, someone shouted, and the sudden sound echoed in the silent night. However, along with this shout, a series of shouts also appeared in all directions in this valley, and it gathered into a single sentence, kill. The serf rebels in the South County who had entered the status of infantrymen had launched the deadliest night attack. Meanwhile, the members of the Night Corps, who were the main force to quell the rebellion, were still sleeping soundly. No one could react in time. Because of the 5,000 people, less than 20 sentries were left. Even these sentries were exhausted from traveling day and night to this place. In addition, they did not pay much attention to the lowly troop class like the serf rebels. However, it was because of this belittlement that led to this night attack. It also made the members of the Night Corps, who were still sleeping in their tents, in a short period of time, they were scattered like a tide by the rebel army. The knights who were still sleeping in their tents woke up in the midst of the loud shouts. However, when they completely woke up, their tents were pierced and torn apart. Then, the enemies rushed in. However, it was too late. The ferocious-looking rebel soldiers used their spears and long sword to pierce through the knights who had already taken off their armor. They were unarmed and couldn't resist at all. They slaughtered them easily. It was really a massacre. A bloody massacre. The knight squires at the outermost perimeter did not have time to react. They were drowned by the rebellion army soldiers who swarmed in. Then, they turned into corpses. They did not even have time to struggle before they were all killed in the tent where they were sleeping soundly. Then, there were the middle-level knight attendants. Perhaps, they even showed some signs of resistance. After all, the squires at the periphery had stopped them for a moment. They immediately woke up when they heard the screams, as well as the sounds of slaughter and ferocious curses. They picked up the weapons beside them, but before they could put on the mail armor, the tent was immediately broken open. Even though they barely used the long sword in their hands to resist a few times, more and more rebels surged in. These knight attendants could not resist at all. They retreated one after another, wanting to go to the tent where the knights were to organize a defense. But their retreat was obviously an action out of a pure panic without time to think. They retreated in a mess. Their strength of resistance had become very low. After causing a small number of casualties among the rebellion soldiers, most of the knight attendants wore simple long robes and held long sword or lance. They quickly retreated, quickly becoming defeated and directly running towards the knights' defensive line. The tents of the knights were in the center. They were also the ones who reacted. Under the double delays of the squires and attendants, these knights were fully armed. However, there were only less than 500 of them. Even with the knight attendants and squires who had retreated, they could only gather around 3,000 people in the end. Among them, there were nearly 1,000 people who did not have time to put on their armor. However, just as these people gathered to resist, they were completely surrounded. The 20,000 elite members of the rebellion army moved out in full force, trapping them firmly in the valley. The front row was armed with long lances and spears, while the back row was filled with elite warriors in heavy armor. On both sides of the valley, there were long-ranged troop-class soldiers armed with bows and crossbows, as well as pylons and catapults. Under the moonlight, they could see clearly even without torches. The same was true for the knights. There was nothing they could do. They could no longer break through this dense encirclement. That was because their war horses were kept on one side of the valley not far away. When the rebel soldiers launched a sneak attack, the tents of the war horses were the first to be destroyed. All the squires who stayed behind were killed. There were no captives left behind. It was to prevent the captives from wasting their energy and taking care of them. However, to the knights who were surrounded in the middle, these uprising army soldiers were as if they had destroyed their most important escape tool. It was simply impossible to break out of the encirclement. Who would have thought that the well-equipped knights would fall to such a state? This was simply impossible. Especially the commanders of the 5 knight corps, who looked at each other in dismay. This time, they had originally planned to stay far away from the main battlefield to relax. However, they did not expect to be in danger of being annihilated now. Looking at the surrounding phalanxes of lance that were less than 50 meters apart, they had nowhere to go. Under the moonlight, the spearheads that flashed with a chilling light carried a terror that could pierce through everything. No one dared to ignore so many lances. Moreover, there were more and more warriors in heavy armor behind them. They held long sword and looked at them coldly. However, when they looked back, they realized that many of their heavy armor looked extremely familiar. It seemed to be their standard armor. That's right, it was indeed the standard weapons and armor of these knights. They found it during the night raid. Then, it was put on by the soldiers of the rebellion army to make the most of it. Even at the top of the valley on both sides, a large number of long-range troop class were waiting for orders. The total number was close to 5,000 men. Although there were only a few war bows and heavy crossbows, most of them were using hunting bows and light crossbows, as well as simple cut javelins. Even the primitive catapults that were temporarily made from 2 leather ropes. However, these were still long-range weapons. From a high vantage point, with the difference of more than 30 meters between the two sides of the hill, the inertia and lethality formed by these long-range weapons was enough to kill. Even if they were trapped here, starving these knights who lacked supplies for 2 days would make them exhausted and lose their combat ability. Even if they were to break out of the encirclement, there would be continuous long-range attacks to exhaust them. During the process of breaking out of the encirclement, more and more of their comrades were killed or injured. This was also a great blow to their morale. It could be said that these 3,000 knights were like fish in a barrel. Rolf came to the top of the hill. Behind him was the leader of the rebellion army. The two of them did not say anything. Instead, they looked at the 3,000 knights who were tightly surrounded in the narrow space below. They stretched out their hands and waved forward. They ordered to take the lead and destroy them before these people were ready to break out of the encirclement. Fire! Their respective middle-level commanders shouted the order. On both sides of the hills, all the long-range weapons were fired at the same time. As the whooshing sound continued, more and more black shadows appeared under the moonlight. The terrifying scythe of death swung down fiercely in the air. It made the knights who were closely arranged into a defensive line under the ground scream in pain. Even hunting bows and light crossbow, heavy pylons and irregular stones could cause heavy casualties to those knights who did not have armor and shields in a hurry, not to mention the lethal arrows shot by war bows and heavy crossbows.